Hello, everyone, and welcome to the second day of the Plan B project. So, we will start in about 1 or 2 minutes, and we'll have our first speaker. It's Don Daglow, who will talk about 8 keys to a long career in games, and we will have our talks connected online. So, you will be also able to see all of the videos after the live stream, as it will be uploaded to our YouTube channel. So make sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel, and you will get notified once we upload all the videos from our gathering. So let me connect you to Don. Hi Don, can you hear me?
I can hear you. Sounds good. Well, everybody, thank you so much for joining me here for this session. This is 8 Keys to a Long Career in Games, and my name is Don Daglow. And we are all adapting to the readily changing events of the coronavirus moment in the history of the world and in San Francisco. Before I started my talk, there's one item I wanted to raise that the current events reminded me of. In San Francisco in 1906, there was a major earthquake and a terrible fire that destroyed much of the city. And my family was living here at the time. My grandparents were living in San Francisco. Their home burned, and my grandfather's shop near the San Francisco Ferry Building also burned. And so they ended up living in a tent in Golden Gate Park, having lost almost everything. And the so this was a story that was told in our family as I was growing up, and always kind of a lesson in you can come back from things. And so I've been thinking about that at this moment. But I also thought after my dad passed away, there was a box of old family stuff he had saved that I went through, and in there was a tiny press clipping, tiny clipping from a newspaper. And at first, I thought it was from something my father had saved himself. And then I noticed the date on it, and the date on it was in late 1906 or early 1907. So it was a few months after the San Francisco earthquake and fire. And this little clipping that my grandfather had saved at a point when they were still living in a tent, and later they lived in a shed. Uh, the clipping he had saved said uh, something to the effect of, although the city now lies in ruins, San Francisco will rise to be even greater than it was before. The current situation with the COVID-19 virus obviously is not leveling cities, but it's deeply affecting many people's lives. But I found that message from 114 years ago to be encouraging and to be a reminder that this will pass and things will get better. And hopefully, as they did in 1906 in San Francisco, all of us can work together. So that was just the thought I had to start us out. So, in talking about 8 keys to a long career in games, hopefully I haven't had 8 careers in games, although sometimes it feels like it. The I'll give you a little background very quickly on what I've been doing for the last almost 50 years. And the first thing you'll notice when you look at this is number one, that I'm old, because next year I will celebrate the 50th anniversary of my first game, but also that there have been a lot of eras and in some ways lots of different careers in games. So I started in the 1970s uh, writing games on mainframes back when none of us ever thought this would be a business. This was just a hobby. We wrote games for our friends. Sometimes they get shared to other people in our own college. And then we actually were surprised when other colleges got some of our games too. When the industry began and I applied for a job at Mattel for the Intellivision team, I said, well, I've been writing games for 9 years. And at first they didn't believe me. It was like, hey, Harry, look at the things these people will say. This guy is saying nobody's written games for 9 years. Why do these people lie like this? And then, of course, they realized I was actually telling the truth, and I got to be one of the original 5 programmers on day one of the in-house Intellivision team at Mattel, with just incredible good luck to have that opportunity. The industry had a severe downturn, otherwise known as a crash, in 1983. And I was lucky again, I got recruited into a little startup called Electronic Arts by Trip Hawkins. Ended up producing 2 of the first 3 sports games for Electronic Arts. Actually, EA was about 12 years old when the EA Sports brand was created as a brand, but we were doing sports games back in those early days of Electronic Arts. I then thought I knew everything about game development, and I left EA, ran Broderbund's games division for a couple of years, and then I started my own studio, Stormfront Studios, which we ran for 20 years, did over 30 major games. And we got caught in the economic downturn of 2008, speaking of economic downturns, had to close the studio. And so for the last 12 years, I've actually been working in a more independent role, working as a consulting producer and advisor. I've written some books, an advisor at the Strong National Museum of Play, which is the largest games museum of the world. And if you ever have a chance to go there, for those of us who are gamers, it is just incredible. I also serve as the volunteer president of the Academy of Interactive Arts and Sciences Foundation, and I'm also an advisor and mentor at the Founders Space Accelerator in San Francisco. The ironic thing and the most important thing about this list, apart from the fact I've been really lucky in the places I've gotten to be, is that for the last 12 years, I've been involved in constant learning because I'm constantly on new kinds of projects, facing new kinds of challenges. And after a period in which I'd really focused on building AAA console games for many years, I got the chance and the challenge to go back and become a real constant student of games again and to learn many new things. I will tell you, I've actually loved the last 12 years simply because I've had the chance to learn so much. So the mentioned writing books. This is the most relevant book I've written, Indie Games from Dream to Delivery. One of our AIS scholars actually illustrated the front cover, which I was very proud about. Danny Powers is her name, a wonderful artist. And I'm also grateful to Rami Ismail for doing the introduction. So the first of our 8 topics I want to discuss is dreams. But as this picture reminds us, dreams can also involve nightmares. So this comes down to this whole question of whose dream is it anyway? In a lot of the sessions I do, in a lot of my private work with companies and teams, I talk about chasing dreams and trying to follow our dreams. And how can we follow our dreams? And so this is a major theme for me. But a very important thing to think about with dreams is whose dream is it? And one example of a dream is, hey, you can barely be beyond being a teenager, and you can be having a very serious conversation with the president of the United States. So here's Mark Zuckerberg, a very young Mark Zuckerberg, having a conversation with Barack Obama. For many people who get involved in games, especially if you're doing a startup or a new studio, this is a dream that enters on your mind. Hey, I could build this studio, it could grow big, we could sell it, I could make a lot of money, or I could operate it, we could go public, I could get famous, I could talk with the president. That is certainly a worthy goal. I mean, the idea of that kind of success is a very reasonable dream and goal. But I think that in the games business, another context is to think about, all right, what do I really want? Why do I like to get up in the morning? And so a story I like to tell is actually about my dad, who's now come up twice in this talk already. Uh, my dad started out his career as an anthropologist. He majored in anthropology. That was his passion. And but he graduated from college just before the Depression, and then that wasn't too long before World War II. And those two events meant anthropology was not a reasonable career. There were no new jobs in anthropology. Anthropology students who were graduating from college were going nowhere in terms of being able to make a living. So he went back to school, worked his way through school again, and got a degree in business, the equivalent of what we would think of as an MBA today. And he went into finance and accounting. My dad did finance and accounting for about 50 years after that, before he finally retired. He never loved it. He did it because it had become his profession. It's how he made money. It's how he supported our family. But he did it because it was a way to get through tough times. And then he felt he couldn't change careers. After that, he couldn't go back and try and go back to anthropology. But if you talked to my dad about business, you would have a very reasonable, interesting discussion. He'd seem like a normal businessman who was involved and interested. But if you talk to my dad about anthropology, now suddenly everything changed. Suddenly his eyes would light up. Um, he would get up and he would walk over to the bookcase, and there'd be this light air in his step that you normally didn't see. And he would start to talk about anthropology, and he would be passionate, excited, happy, opening books. Let's look at this and compare this, and this is how the dentition of this different fossil tells you this, and it was uh, just fascinating stuff. And so, what I learned from that was that what you do for a living and what you're passionate about can be different things, but that doesn't necessarily make you happy. And one of the great gifts that both my parents gave me was the constant message as I was growing up. Yes, put a roof over your head, but find something you love and do what you love. My mother was a professional artist during the Depression. Uh, Ultimately had to change her career as well from being an artist. So she had a very parallel path that she had followed. So both of them gave me tremendous support for following my passions. That has paid off for me. I'm sitting here about to celebrate 50 years of designing computer games and video games, and I still love it. I get up every morning. I'm excited about it. I'm having a great time talking to you today, even in this isolated format instead of GDC. Uh, I'm having a great time doing this because we're talking about games, and that's what I love. So when you're thinking about dreams, it's okay to think about the Mark Zuckerberg dream or the big financial payoff dream. But remember your dream. And your dream is not what your parents wished for you. It's not what Uncle Jack told you should do at a family Thanksgiving dinner. And that's where all the money is, and that's where the future is. And yes, you have to make a living, but think about your passions when you're doing that, and think about your very own personal passions. So one way to think about this and one way to focus on that is very simple. A few years ago, Rami asked a question, I think it was on Facebook, and he said, I'm doing some research, I'm writing an article. Why do you guys make games? And lots of answers came back. And I actually ended up saving, I surprised myself when I wrote my answer. I wrote it instantly. I didn't think about it. I just wrote it. And for me, the answer was this, because once I did it, making games felt like what I was put on this earth to do. And after 49 years of doing it, that feeling hasn't changed. And actually, when I wrote this, it was 45 years. I updated it for this presentation. But I'll tell you the difference between 45 and 49 years with dreams. If it's your real dream, there's no clock on it. That feeling doesn't change. So one thing I can tell you absolutely, I have a lot of opinions in this talk. I have all sorts of opinions to share with you. One thing I can tell you as fact is that if you love building games and this is something you're passionate about, you can spend your whole life doing it and you don't have to lose the love for games by doing it long term. So, next idea actually comes down to a matter of pancakes. Yes, I'm very serious today about what I'm saying, and actually, I am very serious because I think we can learn very important things because games are like pancakes. So, let me see if I can make sense out of that statement. So, one way to make pancakes is to make nice round pancakes. I actually did this, what, 2 weeks ago. I made myself nice round pancakes. I was just making for myself. I poured them in the pan. Each one is still unique, but it's a pretty safe operation once you figured out how to do it and you get the pan to the right heating. There's no risk. But there are other kinds of pancakes. And when our sons were little, they liked it if I made them dinosaur pancakes. So I would try to make a pancake in the shape of an outline of a dinosaur. And unfortunately, I mentioned that my mother was a professional artist. Let's just say I didn't inherit her talents. So making a pancake look like a dinosaur was a challenge for me. And so there certainly were plenty of times when I was trying to make a stegosaurus for our kids, and what came out looked more like a top-down view of an artichoke. So it didn't work out so well. When you're making pancakes, making a unique pancake, trying to make a different kind of a shape, trying to make something that isn't just a variation on round, is hard and it's challenging. It takes skill, it takes practice, it takes iteration. But those pancakes are also less interesting because you can find round pancakes everywhere. So if you're trying to fascinate not just your kids with pancakes, but you're trying to fascinate players with your game, then doing something other than the safe round pancake is higher risk, more frightening, more dangerous, more endangering to your making money and being able to put a roof over your head doing games. All those risks are very real. And I've certainly had highs and lows over almost 5 decades of doing this. But if you're really trying to do something special, doing a pancake that has your shape, the shape you want to create, has the form you're trying to create, is your own work of art that you believe in, that is much harder and riskier than making round pancakes, but it is also a much better way to try to find an audience that believes in you, that loves your work, and wants to keep playing your games. So, as so many things in life and in business, higher risk, higher reward with those kinds of pancakes. So, next theme for me uh, comes back to Groundhog Day. Is I've got a couple of movies actually I want to talk about in this topic, but Groundhog Day is one of them because in Groundhog Day there are a number of lessons, uh, but the big one is he ends up practicing something that's very familiar to us in games. He ends up practicing iteration. Now, we're used to thinking about iteration in terms of uh, game development. Okay, well, we'll iterate on that. It's time boxed, and you know, we're very accustomed to thinking about iteration in terms of the game world, about what we do and how we do our work. But if you're going to have a long career in games, there's another way to look at iteration, and that is iterating ourselves. So I talked about how after working for many years building AAA console games, in 2008, I started working with a variety of projects and teams, everything from Wii games to some early mobile games, to indie games as indies started to emerge more, as well as established publishers doing online and traditional games. And suddenly I was doing lots of different kinds of games, not just one or two kinds of games. And that represented a period of tremendous learning and, ironically, tremendous happiness for me, because now I had to learn new things. I had to change, grow, and reinvent myself. Over the course of my career, I've had to do this several times, and we don't have any way of knowing how, but I would suggest that if you're going to do games for 50 years, you're probably going to have to reinvent yourself too. We cannot know in advance the ways in which we'll need to reinvent ourselves, because the industry and the world are always surprising us. The poet Khalil Gibran had a great way of putting this. He was talking about how you can't run your children's lives and you can't decide everything for your children, but it also applies to our careers and our games. And he said, "For your children belong to the world of the future, which you cannot visit, not even in your dreams." The future is something we have to live. We can't know what it is. But one thing I believe we can know, having long careers in games, is we can know that at some point things will change so much that we have to change with them. We have to reinvent ourselves, adapt, and iterate ourselves into new people. The only way to get out of Groundhog Day is to use the time to change yourself fundamentally. The only way to keep from getting into a rut in games and potentially letting time pass you by and finding yourself ejected from the industry because you did not adapt and grow with it. The only way to avoid that kind of video games Groundhog Day is to keep reinventing yourself. If you reinvent yourself, you will innovate in your games. It will just come into your games and the way you help build games as a matter of course. So I think that's an important lesson. And if you look back at the crash of 1983, when everything fell apart and almost all the jobs in games went away, I was very fortunate, and a lot of it was luck, but I got to keep working, but I had to learn absolutely new things. And this has happened over and over again in my career. Now, I mentioned The Wizard of Oz. There's another message out of that. I've been talking a lot about our dreams, individuals, your personal dream, your personal goal, what you want. I've been talking about reinventing yourself, focusing inward so that you iterate on yourself, not just on your games. But in the modern games industry, teams are also incredibly important. And it isn't just us as individuals. When I wrote mainframe games back in the 70s, where we thought we were just doing it as a hobby, even then we were teaming up on projects. Even then you'd have somebody come in. When I was working on my adaptation of Star Trek in 1971 through 74, at one point there was some interesting math to really make it the numbers being used for location of spaceships be expressed in three-dimensional math. And I worked with another student named Jonathan Osser. And John did that 3D math because I was a playwriting major in college. I wasn't up doing a lot of advanced math. And so that was something he could do, and he did that math for the game. So we were already teaming. John and I probably worked together on that, I would guess, in 1972. So there have always been teams in games, but back then most games were individual. When I wrote Utopia in 1981 on Intellivision, I coded the whole game myself, but I still got to use some lines of codes as an audio, what today we would think of as an audio driver, the audio code that another engineer had written. And I did all the art, which is horrifying, but because these old machines were so primitive and so blocky, we had programmer art back at the very beginning of that time. Then we brought in artists because programmer art is not pretty. But there was one point where the coastline, Utopia has two islands in it, and I couldn't quite get the coastline to work, and I was running out of memory, and so I couldn't make more tiles. I couldn't use any more memory because this is a 4K cartridge that all the whole game had to live in. So everything was very compact and tight. And I needed to cut 2, maybe 3 tiles. And one of the industrial designers at Mattel Toy Company worked with me, and he found a way to arrange the tiles to cut 2 or 3 tiles out of the map. And that allowed me to save memory, that allowed me to get the game in where it would fit in 4K. So again, classic old retro game, but we still had teams. Today, teams are even more important because the scale of games we're building are often far too big for any one player to do it. There are exceptions. PUBG started from a single creative idea, a single creator, and so there are exceptions. But generally speaking, in the end, it takes a team. So I talk so much about following your dream, thinking about what you really want to do, thinking about your ideas, your hopes, your vision. But that teamwork is also critical. If you can't play nicely with others, if you can't collaborate really effectively, it's also simply going to be hard to have a long-term career in games because that skill is so essential. I think that skill was also essential, however, on the playground when we were kids, being able to play well with others, not just by ourselves. And so I don't think that's just about the modern industry or, oh, it's getting all big and it's corporate and it's big teams and gigantic and the loss of the individual. And yes, that does happen sometimes. We all know that happens sometimes. But that's not the issue I'm talking about here. What I'm talking about is the ability to recognize that often teams together brainstorm the best ideas, the best solutions, rather than just going it on our own. The other danger of going it on your own is I always use this slide to remind myself, and that is when you're just doing everything on your own, inevitably you're faking it somewhere. And there's the old thing of fake it till you make it, and we've all done that. Well, Frimbage, do you know how to set up the widget machine?
Oh, yes, I do, sir. I know how to set. Yeah, yes, I can set up the machine. I'd be happy to do that.
All right, Fribbage, why don't you go ahead and do that? And of course, Fribbage at that moment goes, I have no idea how to do this, but I said yes because I want to please the boss. How am I going to go do it? We've all done our version of that. But if we're so determined to work as individuals, if we're so determined that it's just going to be all about me, inevitably, when we get to the places where we're faking it till we make it, somebody's going to notice. And just as when the heroes of the Wizard of Oz notice that the Wizard of Oz is faking it, we don't want to have those moments. So one of the payoffs for working with the team is that if you don't know how to do something, you can team up with people who do, and then you won't have that Wizard of Oz faking it and not yet making it moment. So speaking of lessons from movies, I've always thought that Gene Wilder taught me some good lessons in his films. So in Young Frankenstein, I think there's a lesson there as well. And that is sometimes it really is brain surgery, and brain surgery is a very important thing. If I look at this picture, I know that I want all the people standing up in this photograph. If I'm the person on the receiving end of this care, I want everybody in this photograph who's standing up to be really well trained. I want them to be specialists. I want them to be experts because there's a lot at stake. I don't want them to be faking it till they make it. And so the same is true of games in our current era, in our current time. And I'll get to that guy in a second. So let me actually go back and let me talk about brain surgery. Our industry, I mentioned about the fact that if you go back 30, 40, 50 years, we were doing one person, one game, and occasionally collaborating. I wrote an email in, I think, 1984 to Electronic Arts to the leaders of the company saying we need to be more receptive to having teams build games because we've always had this model, but times are changing now in 1984. We have to change with the times. Well, that has certainly happened, but part of what's happened is we do get specialists, and we need specialists because the intricacy of what we do has changed so much. If you look back at old Atari and Intellivision games from the first wave of video games at the beginning of the industry, the graphics are incredibly blocky. The standard of what you could do on the system in 4,000 bytes and change was very, very low. Now we have systems that beautifully reproduce broadcast quality of streaming movies on your big TV. The level of skill needed just for the visuals at that point is tremendous. The machines we have now are many multiples of times faster than the initial video games, even faster by far than the big mainframe computers I started working on so long ago. That speed demands a different kind of engineering. Ironically, working in assembly language the way we did back in those days is in some ways part of that skill. And being able to do things fast sometimes drives you out of high level languages and back into assembly. But apart from those things, it is that precision and that specialty. I'm not always happy to say it, but if you want a long term career in the games industry, having a specialty at which you have a rare and unique skill is very, very important. It radically increases your chances of being able to continually long-term work in the industry. And that's why I come down to this gentleman in really for probably the 200 and 250 years prior to our era, our current modern era. People talked about the brilliance of somebody who had a well-rounded education, who had tremendous knowledge of many, many things. And so this old photo of a British gentleman represents, in some ways, that ideal, someone who had this breadth of knowledge and could handle many different subjects, many different challenges, many different things. The problem is that the world in which he lived, and in fact, the world in which, for many people in the industry today, their grandparents lived, still rewarded that jack of all trades, master of none. If you haven't heard that phrase, it refers to somebody who in construction could do pretty good carpentry, pretty good plumbing, pretty good electrical, pretty good whatever. They weren't as good as the specialists in any of those things, but they could do it all. And they could actually build their own house all by themselves if you gave them enough time. So jack of all trades, master of none was a compliment. The problem we have now is if you are a jack of all trades, master of none, there's always an artist who's better than you. There is always a technical artist or a designer or an engineer or any of the other specialties, an audio engineer, a composer. There's always somebody who's better than you if you're pretty good at everything. Being pretty good at everything will no longer guarantee you a long career in games. And for a long time said, oh, well, that's the person who becomes the producer. Yeah, because they understand the whole picture. Maybe they can't do all of it at the necessary level, but they're the producer. I think there's a time when that was true. And I happened to have been one of the first producers in the games industry and the first handful of producers in the games industry. And I think that was a way we felt about ourselves in 1984 about, well, one reason we can do this job is we've done all of the jobs that are involved on a single creator basis. And now we're in a position where we can do this. But I think that's past too. Production itself is now a specialty. Understanding how to produce, how to project manage is itself now a specialty. Game marketing which I believe that we as game creators, and frankly, I as a game creator in the old days, did not value anywhere near as highly as I should have, uh, I think is now a specialty, and it is a critically important specialty. And working with game marketers who are specialists is essential in many parts of the industry today, if not all parts. So, ironically, even though it hurts me in some ways to say it, finding a specialty where you can make yourself rare and sought after and make yourself a hard to find specialist, that is the path forward. And picking a specialty that aligns with your passions. It isn't a matter of saying, well, engineers are always in short supply. I'll do engineering. Well, what if you try engineering and you hate it? You don't want to be like my dad and do a career you feel you have to do for 50 years and hate it as you do it. That's going to squelch your passion. That's going to destroy your passion and your happiness. So it's a matter of finding a specialty where you can become rare and in demand, but also something you love. It doesn't mean giving up what you love. It means finding the intersection between what you love and a specialty that'll keep you employed in the games industry. That may sound like a slightly cynical view, but it's simply practical. We have to relearn, we have to grow, we have to continually adapt, and that continuing to learn in our specialty is a key part of it. So as you can see, these ideas that I'm sharing as my opinions all do interlace and interact and tie together. Now I'm going to go and I'm going to contradict everything I just said. So, because life is a mass of contradictions. So if you look back at we would say the great Renaissance man or great Renaissance woman, and uh, two examples, obviously, Da Vinci and Anguissola. Anguissola, you probably have heard less about because the men get chronicled more. But if you go back and read about her story, phenomenal artist, became a court painter, a royal member of the royal court, painting for the King of Spain in the same manner as Velázquez, and later ended up being given a noble title. And part of her skill was that she was not only skillful as a painter, but she had broad education and broad background. Da Vinci, we know, did engineering, what we would now recognize as engineering design, as well as painting. So these are two examples, Renaissance man, Renaissance woman, of people who had this great diversity of skill. So even though I'm talking about specialties, I'm not trying to discourage you from that ideal of having broad knowledge, because in fact, having broad knowledge is tremendously helpful to what we do. If you look at, for one example, if you look at shooters and say, well, you don't exactly need to be from Renaissance Italy to know how to put a story on a shooter. Well, you could say that literally that's true. But what has happened in the industry today, any game like this needs to be narrative driven, needs to have a story mode, needs to have some way that you come to care about the characters. So it's more than just, okay, here's another shooter, here's what's unique about it, here's that setup, okay, go. Battle Royale has taken that to an art form where all you're doing is a quick battle that's based as pure game. That's placed more pressure, not less, on teams doing full-scale shooters to be able to do storytelling. That's why it's critical. So understanding storytelling is not just a matter of, oh yeah, well, we'll hire some good writers and they'll do it for us. An entire team has to think in a storytelling mode where they care about it. Storytelling, having been originally trained as a playwright, we weren't just taught, okay, here's how you write, here's a way to get people interested. We were taught about the craft of creating a mood, of creating emotion, of creating characters you care about. One of the most famous things about writing 101 is somebody comes in and says, I have a great idea for a plot, for a story, I know what to do. And the teacher turns to the student who has said this and says, "Oh, no, I'm not interested in plot. Oh, no, yes, young Skywalker. I don't care about plot. I care about character." Well, developing character is a matter of story. It's a matter of backstory. It's a matter of art. It's character design. It's concept art. It's all of these things. It's environments. It's setting. What does the setting tell you about? What challenges does it present? Every discipline in all of games has to care about storytelling in these games, and has to care not just about storytelling, but about characters, the emotions they have, the emotions they create, they generate. To do that, you need to have that greater background. You can't just be, "Oh, I just draw what they tell me to." It's a matter of thinking for yourself to find the joy in your own art of saying, how do we bring this character to life? It's not just a matter of, hey, I can make it fast. Okay, does making it fast make it more compelling? Does it create stronger emotions in the player? Leonardo da Vinci and Anguissola were people who could create emotion. In fact, look at the painting. She's shown painting here and the link between mother and child. And we have an emotional reaction just to this painting. And she painted it hundreds of years ago. Yet what she painted is so eternal, we react to it emotionally now. That's why being a Renaissance person, even as we develop our specialties, is so important. So if we come back to the Intellivision after that, after thinking about uh, uh, Renaissance, being Renaissance people, and self-development and specialties and so on, then there's a lesson for which we go back really to the very earliest stages. This is the Intellivision, the console. We were at war with Atari back in the very early 1980s. And there's some important lessons to learn out of this time. And to go with that, I always look at this chart. And so there's a lot of chart like these. Here's that we're seeing the evolution of the horse. And in support of my note about how we have to reinvent and develop ourselves and grow ourselves, when I look at this chart, I think about, okay, which one of these 5 creatures would I want to be? And I have a very ready answer for this question. I would like to be the horse, the modern horse, because only the modern horse is still alive.
All of these other characters are dead. If I can be a dead character or a live character, I choose to be a live character.
And I joke about it, but the fact is that the need to adapt and change, lines of creatures that did not adapt and change die out, and you show their chart, and every picture on the chart is dead. I like charts with living creatures and characters at the end of them. So this is another message about how we adapt, because one of the reasons why we had the first wave of video games crash was that we were so focused on the industry we're in at that time that we did not simply adapt to what was coming. So a big part of this was that the video game industry grew up out of the toy business. When Nolan Bushnell and Ted Dabney started Atari and then did home video game machines, starting with Pong, those machines were sold in toy stores. And if they were sold in a big department store, they were sold in the toy section of that store. So in modern terms, today you would only find, if the industry had not changed, you'd only find video games at Toys R Us. Oops, they've gone out of business. Or in the toy section at Target and maybe a couple other kinds of stores. But we thought of ourselves as working as part of the toy industry, as part of toy companies. I worked for Mattel Toy Company, the guys who made Barbie and Hot Wheels. And with that mindset, that limited the way we looked at games. And I think that as we started to be sold in computer stores, which started even to happen in this era, where small indie games were being sold on floppy disks, packed in Ziploc bags that were sold on pegboards in computer stores. That started to widen our vision for what games could be. But we were also prisoners of that world. So in the toy business, part of the wisdom of how you survive in the toy business is that toys are hits. You'll have toys come in like Tickle Me Elmo, and they'll be a big success, and they will prosper for 1, 2, maybe 3 years, maybe even longer. But when that toy loses popularity and starts to fall off, what toy store owners knew and what big chain toy stores knew at that time was once a big hit toy starts to fade, get rid of your inventory, mark it down, move it out. Because when it fails off the edge of a table. And so whether it's Tickle Me Elmo or Cabbage Patch Kids back in this old era, you can make millions and millions selling these toys, but when they start to go, they really go. So get out early, don't get out late. Ironically, the same thing happened to toy stores with the original Nintendo Entertainment System, which, as we know, was a tremendous success, brought console games back from the hell and the disappointment we had lived in. But when next gen happened and moved on from the NES, a lot of stores lost a lot of money on their inventory because they didn't get out early. So this is true of the old toy business. So in video games become this big hit in the early 1980s. And of course, everybody comes rushing into the industry. Everybody wants to make money off of video games. I am not joking when I point out that the Quaker Oats Company got into the video game business and created a games division. I am not kidding. Quaker Oats, they make cereal. And they opened a video game division because every big corporation wanted to try and make money in video games. So, of course, the market is flooded with cheap, badly made games. And this is why Sony and Nintendo and Microsoft try to control the games on their systems now, is to avoid this happening again. And so as the market got flooded, a lot of this product did not sell. And these were brand new, poorly funded companies very often. When the stores went to return the games that didn't sell, because our industry operates on a consignment basis with physical games that they don't sell, retailers can send them back. And they went to return these games that didn't sell. And of course, the companies were so small they couldn't give their money back, and those companies went bankrupt. The stores looked at all this and said, wait, a lot of this new stuff isn't selling. You know what? Video games are a fad. It's like Cabbage Patch Kids. We have to get out of it. Okay, it's time to sell, everybody. Hey, guys, dump your inventory of games. And retailers made some attempts to find ways to keep doing it. And they concluded, no, this is over. And so the distributors who controlled virtually all of our industry, of course, this is years before the internet. There's no online business. There is only physical brick and mortar retail. There are no downloads. It's just physical brick and mortar retail. There were just the first experiments in things that we would now think of as online delivery of games, and they were tiny, tiny experiments. So when all of your retailers decide to stop buying your category of product, what happens? What happens was that all of the video game companies went into free fall, and we went from having thousands and thousands of jobs in video games to having just a few hundred jobs that were really more in the computer game side, with the Commodore 64 driving the business rather than anything else. Most people in the industry lost their jobs. This is just a reminder that one of the things we have to do is not just look at the way the world is today, but we have to look at the way the world could become, and we have to understand that the way the world is today will change. Whatever makes us happy about the way the games industry works today, it will change. Now, the good news is whatever makes us unhappy about the great games industry today, that's likely to change too. But change is constant and unavoidable. This comes back to Khalil Gibran, that we cannot live in the future because the world we cannot visit, not even in our dreams. We have to wait for it and live it. So that's why I want to be adaptable. It's also, though, why I want to re-emphasize as I talk about specialties and anticipating change, you don't have to have just one passion. And although these are all old examples from early in my career, I think this still holds true. These are all games from the first, 15 years of my career, my professional career, where they're games where I led the design team or I did the design. So Utopia on Intellivision, the original Neverwinter Nights on AOL, Stronghold, which was a D&D meets SimCity game back in the early 90s, and Honored Eagle Eye Mysteries and The Roots of Baseball. And even back then, a lot of people would say to me, Don, it's so weird. I mean, you like sports games and you like role-playing games and you do educational stuff. I mean, how can you like building educational games and sports games and RPGs? And I can't go, why would I not like all three of those? I don't have to like just one thing in my life. I don't have to just you have to have not only a passion, you have to have a very narrow passion. Yes, I'm an engineer. I only work in languages that begin with the letter C. So I work with C. If I ever needed to learn it, I'd happily learn COBOL. But no language if a language doesn't begin in the letter C, I don't want to code in it because code begins with a C. Well, of course, this is silly. And by the way, COBOL was incredibly innovative when it was invented so many years ago, but was an awful, awful language. And take my word for it, you don't ever want to be anywhere near COBOL. It's good that times change when you think about COBOL, although at the time it was invented, it was a breath of fresh air. So you don't have to put yourself in a narrow channel to specialize and to follow your passions. You can have different passions. And this remains true today. I have been, just in the last couple of years, I've been involved in the same kind of a variety of games. So that's something you are not required to have only one interest, and you shouldn't only code in languages that begin with the letter C. By the way, one upside of following your passions, this is just a fun aside for the moment, is you can look back many years later and see people paying, $405 for a game. At least that was what it was up for. And there were games that sold in that price, original Neverwinter Nights that would sell for that. 26 Watchers, World Series Major League Baseball, $450. So those are nice little payoffs for what you do. But taking that big view, looking at the whole world, and then imagining how it could change, those are very important things. So that's why I say study the big picture as a key thing and how these all tie together. And there's another example about studying the big picture. When we looked at this, our whole view of everything changed. I've actually managed to use a lot of our time, so I'm going to go through the last points pretty quickly because I think I've actually kind of hit them as I talked. Studying and understanding the big picture does sometimes involve technical knowledge and studying those details. Studying the voters pamphlet when you get it. I live in California. I'm showing you a state of Washington voters pamphlet, but you get the idea. I also think you have to be very suspicious of guys who go around telling you what to think, what to do, including me. So when you listen to these ideas, that's what they are. They're ideas. They are opinions. But what you think and how you feel is what matters. And you're not seeing me on the live feed here today, but if you did, I'm wearing a bigger headset than this, but I'm probably sitting here in my office And I'm probably doing some of these same poses as I talk to the screen here on the headset. And my passion and my interest and my thoughts and my longevity of doing this so long don't always make me right. I would like to think I'm sharing interesting ideas with you, but they don't make me right. You are the one who decides what's right for you. So, along those lines, one other thing to remember is that in our dreams, I talked at the beginning about not having somebody else's dream, but having your own, and not feeling, oh, I want to be Captain Industry. I want to make billions and found a big company. I like watching American Idol, and one thing you see each year is you start out with thousands of people who have a dream of being a musician and making a living as a musician. And that leads us to think about what Joni Mitchell called the star-making machinery behind the popular song. So you see people following that passion who are busking on street corners. Some people are gigging in clubs and making some money, even more money on it, but they're not making a living at it necessarily. Then you have some people who are working as part of symphonies, working full time, taking students on top of that. They tour around the world. But yet we often start thinking, if we dream of a singing career, well, I want to be like Adele. I want to be one of the biggest stars in the world. I want to be, she's my role model. But at that point, we're just back to the Mark Zuckerberg fantasy again, because now it's not about passion. It's about going to be a big star. And sometimes trying to be a big star gets in the way of doing what you need to do, learning what you need to learn, changing and growing in ways you need to grow in order to be the best musician or the best game developer. So Mark Zuckerberg and Adele, as wonderful as they are at what they've done, and as much as I admire many aspects of what they've done, and frankly, I love listening to her sing, that isn't the only dream that pays off. And there's only a few of those payoffs in the whole world. And you don't need those payoffs to be happy. Happiness comes from chasing the dream you want to chase. The danger of that in the games industry is sometimes when games or music are being marketed, one very talented and special creator can get to where they're being marketed the same way. So we're not just selling the game. And that starts I want to be famous. I want to have the poster with my face on it. I don't want to just have a famous game. I want to be famous. I've seen a lot of people who took their careers the wrong way, chasing fame instead of a creative dream and a vision of games that will entertain and fascinate players. Chasing this is not what gets you there. Building games that fascinate your players and make them want to keep playing, that's what gets you to the point of fame. But you can't do it by trying to be famous. This is how you build great games. This is how I see it. And this is just a bunch of guys working together. This group, in fact, at Games Academy, where I've had the honor of speaking a number of times in Berlin, which is why I chose this photo. But this is where great games come from, in my view, is people just sitting around working together, iterating, sharing ideas to build great games. So if you're thinking about this, I would respectfully recommend resetting your thoughts to think about this. One final of my 8 points is just here's an old GDC, which we're not having this year, but it reminds us that games can have 20,000 plus people. It's 29,000 last year. And it's still a very small industry. And that's not all just because we're at home. After doing this for so many years, when I go to GDC, even with 29,000 people there last year, every time I walk down the hall, I'm seeing people I know. Oh, I haven't seen you for 2 years. I haven't seen you for 5 years. What this also means is that karma applies. And people may think, oh, this is such a big business now, 29,000 people at GDC in 2019. And, what I do won't matter. Nobody's going to remember 5 years from now what I did. And some people will start, especially people who have control of money on a project, will start to do things that maybe they're not proud of. Maybe the other people aren't proud of. Maybe the other people think they should not have done. But they feel like, hey, it won't matter down the line. I'll tell you, does matter. Karma, with 29,000 people at GDC, karma should be something that works occasionally. I will tell you from personal experience watching people's careers that karma does not always work, but over the long haul, it's amazing how efficiently karma punishes people who are disrespectful of others, who cheat others, who take advantage of others, and how often over the long haul, karma rewards those who help others, are kind to others, are supportive to others. And the I can't tell a lot of the examples without telling the kind of personal stories I don't share about others. But I will share the absolute conviction that if you watch this games industry for 20, 30, 40 years, karma is very powerful. Even in today's huge industry, it finds a way of coming home. So when you think about how you want to treat others around you in your career and in the business, please just remember karma and that being honorable, straight, and trustworthy and trying to be those things uh, pays off in the long run better than anything else. So in the end, it comes back to the beginning. It comes back to things that are very old, and it's your dream. And my final point to wrap this up is it may be your dream, but you have to live it. You have to do it. Having a dream and sitting back and not doing anything about that dream doesn't create a wonderful game. It doesn't give you the career or the life you want for yourself in games. It doesn't give your players the chance to play your game. They're not playing at all or they're playing somebody else's game. A dream is only a dream until you live it and you bring it to life. I had a bunch of wild dreams last night. They aren't real. The dreams we bring to life that we live, that we put into action, those are our dreams. Those are what are meaningful. So I go back to what I did in my answer to Rami's question, because making games felt like what I was put on this earth to do. And all these years later, the feeling hasn't changed. It's your dream and you have to live it. And one more twist on that that I put at the end of so many of my talks is you have players out there who are waiting to be fascinated by your game, who 20 years, 30 years from now can come up to you and say, oh, I played your game years ago. It was so important to me and I loved it. And here's why. That can't happen. They can't have that experience, that thrill of playing your game until you build it, until you develop yourself, your ideas, you chase your dreams, you develop your specialties, you maintain the breadth of your interest and your knowledge, and you build those games. Those players can't do it. Building games is a special opportunity we have. It's a special privilege. And don't waste the opportunity you have to do that, to have that be your life's work, if and only if that's what you believe it was your life's work to do. So thank you so much. Here's my contact information, a couple of my books. I really appreciate you listening to my presentation today. These are wild times, but this too shall pass. And I look forward to being with you in the games business, collaborating long into the future as long as I get to do this. Thank you so much. And I appreciate your time today at this session.
Thank you, Don, and for this inspirational talk. And all the videos that will be streaming today also will be available on our YouTube channel. So everyone who's interested to also see it again will be able to see it on Plan B Project YouTube channel. So make sure to subscribe to our channel to make sure that you will get all the videos from YouTube and from all the talks that we'll have today and also will have tomorrow. So we will continue in about 5 minutes with the next talk about the game design from Menno van Pelt-Deen. So stay connected and we'll see you in about 5 minutes. Hi, Menno. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Good, good.
Okay, sounds great. So just you can introduce yourself and then you can jump into the presentation.
YouTube. Thank you all for tuning in and checking out my little presentation about the project we've made for the last 5 years. It's called Dildo. My name is Menno. I'm one of the developers and organizers of this game wish tool. I normally make games like these in the swimming pool. Or in weird contexts, that's what we like, to make people physically active or have them move, have them connect to one another. I think this connection goes further on the Games for Diversity Foundations that I'm the main chairman of. So we bring together game developers to work on different perspectives, LGBTQ, ethnic backgrounds, religion, refugees, and all sorts of interesting backgrounds that are less represented in game culture nowadays. And last but not least, I'm now working on this cool game, which I'm really excited about. This is a sort of Candy Crush matchmaking game that will help and contribute to cancer research. So, but that's not what I'm going to talk about for you yet, or not today. Today I'm here on an even more serious subject, sexual abuse. Yeah, it's always hard to start, like getting from my really cool and happy work to this kind of tough subject. But let me explain a little bit. It's sort of a story that I'd like to tell you. And it starts almost 20 years ago when my friend Marcel was 11 years old. He was on holiday with his family and he was really curious about his body and that of others. He followed an older man into the forest, and what started as an exciting experiment rapidly went out of hand. In minutes, he lost control. His personal boundaries were transgressed in a way he couldn't really understand. And this was no longer fun or exciting. It was invasive and abusive. Marcel struggled to get loose, and he was really lucky to get away. In blind panic, he ran back to his family, back to safety, and back to his mother. However, every step closer to home made him regret the decision that he made. His parents did caution him not to go with strangers, and fear slowly transformed into guilt with every step closer to home. He ended saying nothing to his parents, and he chose to deal with the secret on his own. These few minutes made a tremendous impact on Marcel's life. Exploring his sexuality was not something that he took lightly. Setting his boundaries in intimate relationship was extraordinarily hard. His dreams were filled with moments like the one I just described, and it became harder and harder to lie to his family about what happened. And although he thought, like, once you start a lie, you stick with it, you slowly discover that lies only grow bigger over time. 10 years ago, Marcel and I became friends. I was the first person that he trusted with his secrets. We found a psychologist, and he worked for years to put his feeling into perspective. And I was watching and helping, but I still didn't feel I was really helping. Gladly, a couple of years ago, a particular event presented itself with an opportunity to support Marcel as a friend. The last summit in Denmark, organized by Fredrik Jarnfeldt and Andrea Hazelager, explored how developers could integrate love, sex, and romance into game design. I was invited to speak on behalf of our foundation, the Games for Diversity, to explain how LGBTQ perspectives could incite new and innovative gameplay. At the same moment, I was also working on a project called Games for Diversity, Games for Therapy. We explored the design process of therapeutic games. Our targeted audience were clients with externalizing problems. There you go. And I didn't get it. I really didn't. I didn't understand what it felt to be so quickly angered as my clients were. Nor was I able to fathom what it meant to always blame someone else for things that went wrong. Because I could not relate to my target audience's feelings, I could not come up with a good design practice. Struggling with the situation, I talked to Marcel, and he says, it's kind of funny, right? You don't understand me, but you do understand me. Or if you don't understand them, but you do understand me. And then it hit me, like, why not make a game for Marcel? So I asked Marcel to accompany to Denmark and enroll in the Last Summit Game Jam. We decided to make a therapeutic game for sexually abused children. This meant that we needed a therapeutic expert, someone who really knew how to deal with these issues, and we also needed a designer and developer that were accustomed to creating serious games. I invited Frank Lips, a really close friend of mine. He's a psychologist in the field of sexual child abuse, and he was actually really thrilled to see what my game world could do for his clients. I asked Tim Pelgrim and Paul Beerhuis from the company Yip Yip to join me in the effort. I knew both of them really well, and I knew that they would treat the subject with care, and I think more importantly, without any preconceptions. We traveled to Copenhagen and joined the Last Summit, and on Friday we started to conceptualize the game. This resulted in pretty futile efforts to connect to Marcel's feelings. It proved tremendously hard and difficult to pinpoint a strong design direction. This was because Marcel's feelings were rather diffuse, complex, and really intertwined with one another. After 4 hours of futile brainstorming, prototyping, and discussions, Marcel stood up and he said, wait, I think I need to tell the full story for you to really understand what I went through. And he started, and he talked for 2 hours straight. We listened and we waited and let Marcel spell out every insecurity, every feeling of anger, and every joyful moment of those few minutes. After his monologue, Marcel leaned back, tired. We didn't have any questions anymore. We didn't need any extra explanation because we understood. I think we understood better than before what it meant if your boundaries were transgressed on such an intimate level. After a few moments, one of us spoke up. He told a story in which his intimate boundaries were transgressed. It turned out that after Marcel's story, we all remembered moments in our life where our boundaries were transgressed on a rather intimate level. Those moments were hard, they were painful, and they would sometimes even make us angry. Our stories related to those of Marcel, with one big exception. Our transgressions occurred when we were adults.
Nou, wat er letterlijk ligt op 2 schermen.
This resulted in a game in which children could explore intimate relationship without someone, without a need to speak to one. Yeah. But one of the things that we learned during these discussions, and when everybody spoke up and opened up to one another, was that we had really much difficulty finding the right words to describe our feelings. Our feelings were so intertwined and so ambiguous. Like, do you fuck with someone, or do you make love to someone? Do you penetrate someone, or do you give someone a blowjob? I don't know. Every time when you talk about these subjects, the words that you use seldom describe the actual feelings you have and what it means to you to do it. And it becomes really blatant, is that word, really quickly. We figured like, oh shit, like if we have trouble figuring out what kind of vocabulary we should use, imagine what children have to go through. And that's why we decided to make a game in which children could explore their intimate relationship with someone in non-verbal ways. And we also like to focus a little bit on boundary setting there. This is the game that came out of it, and it will be explained by Ellen Verwerda and Frank, who are therapists at de Rading.
Nou, wat er letterlijk ligt zijn 2 schermen en 2 iPads. En de ene gebruikt de therapeut en de andere gebruikt het kind. En die kan het kledingstuk uittrekken of kan ook aangeven aan de therapeut van goh. En toen trok hij mijn t-shirt uit, waarop de therapeut het uit kan trekken. En dan in gesprek kan komen over hoe was dat dan voor jou?
Als je personage hebt aangeklikt, heb je aan de rand van het spel, je ziet, het zijn prachtige figuurtjes trouwens, ik vind ze echt zo mooi. Er zit een handje aanraken, er zitten geslachtsdelen, er zit een mond. Dus er zitten verschillende onderdelen die je kan aanklikken en daar doe je vervolgens iets mee bij jezelf of bij de ander.
Er zit een stopknop op en daarmee kun je de grens aangeven. Time-out. En dan kun je verder of je stopt. En dat is natuurlijk het moment waarop ik in gesprek ga met een kind.
Feel is a simple game, or maybe better, a playful tool that offers children the opportunity to express their feelings and tell their story in non-verbal ways. It sort of resembles the real-life dolls that are sometimes used in therapy sessions, but with one big exception. It's the focus on setting boundaries. After the game jam, we entered the game into an innovation competition by the KF Heinfonds. We won a sum of money, like not much, but still. But this award was an incentive for the Mental Health Institute, de Rading, to invest in the actual development of Veeldoen. Now, 3 years after the game session, the game is finished. And as we speak, the game is being implemented in various sessions of de Rading. Veeldoen, which is Danish for the word would you, offers children the opportunity to express their feelings. This works, and that's kind of cool, but also kind of hard to see. Because it sort of persuades children to talk about things that they normally do not want to talk about. I think one of the most exemplary cases was that one of an 8-year-old child, she was sexually abused by her neighbor and was not able to tell the full story. When prompted, whether she told the full story, she clearly stated, oh, not everything. Frank was allowed to videotape the session and showed it to me. And this is what happened. In the third session, game for a minute or two, and she thought it was tremendously funny to undress the older man, saying, "Ha, now you are naked." After playing around in the game, the therapist turned to the initial question. What happened? Why haven't you told us yet? She piped down and looked towards the ground, and she said nothing. Could you maybe show it with the tablet? Frank suggested. The girl nodded. She dressed down the older man, selected a hand from the GUI, and said, like this, with his fist. And she moved her hand back and forth, suggesting that the man was masturbating. The 8-year-old girl did not really know how to explain what happened, both her understanding and vocabulary fell short. She literally did not have the words to describe masturbation. With Vildu, she could, well, partly. The ambiguity of the graphical design prompted her to explain what she actually meant. Frank explained to me that it normally takes like several weeks of building trust before children are able to express this level of detail. With Vildu, we accomplished what Frank normally takes 3 weeks in merely 20 minutes. Moving forward, this was just one happening, and gladly we're moving on with actually implementing the game in therapy sessions. We are working on a training module to teach our therapists how to use the game in therapy sessions. The University Medical Center of Utrecht is involved in the design and the validation of therapy tools and methods. They're basically making a manual for therapists to use Vildu in actual sessions. Furthermore, we are actively reaching out to other parties in mental health care, forensics, and education. For example, we're talking to Pretty Woman to help Loverboy victims to talk about their experience, and we are also actively in conversation with the police. We even won Best Serious Game during the Dutch Game Awards, which was a rather prestigious award in the Netherlands. And well, as I said, the game was developed while working on a project called Games for Therapy. And thanks to the development of Vildu, we gained some really valuable insights in the design of therapeutic games. I think one of the most important to us is to focus on something small. I think when it comes to design and to therapy sessions and stuff, therapists tend to it's kind of hard to express what's the focus on something, because it's all complex and intertwined, right? But thanks to this really strong design exercise, we learned 3 lessons. I think 1 was to subtilize the problem, which I will go into detail a little bit later. 2 is to create a non-normative play space. And 3 is to design for ambiguity, which can stimulate conversation. So let's start with the first one. With subtilizing the problem, I mean that even though sexual abuse or rape may feel as something that's, well, we would say far away from your bed, but that doesn't really concern you. That doesn't mean that it's the case. I think everybody has been in an intimate relationship. Everybody who has been in an intimate relationship had his or her boundaries transgressed in smaller or bigger ways. And tapping into those experiences will help to design something that connects to this experience. By subsidizing the problem, I mean make the therapeutic experience of someone else smaller and easier to relate to. This helps you to understand the experience, and more interestingly, it may enrich the design process with your personal input. Vildu is in essence a non-normative game. Everything is possible without us as designers making preconceptions about what is right or what is wrong. For example, in Vildu, players can choose any character, from young to old, from male to female. They can engage in any type of relationship and in any type of sexual and intimate play. The game does not stipulate which relationship is most healthy. Instead, it suggests that every sexual relationship is okay, as long as you're able to say no. As a result, the game doesn't really demonize the players, but may open up discussions about sex instead. Lastly, Vildu is a rather explicit game. You can address characters until they are fully naked, that's pointed out on the App Store, and the action icons are based on the physical parameters of the characters. Amongst others, there's a vagina, a penis, a hand, a tongue, a mouth. These are rather explicit. However, the use of the icons have various connotations. It's not the game that explains how to interpret the play. It's the player who gives meaning to the interaction. A hand on an arm could mean stroking or caressing it. However, it can also be used to slap or pinch someone. It's the same movement, but this ambiguity invites players to express what they are doing, helping them in small steps to verbalize what happened or what they wanted to occur. The design of Wildu was a rather enriching experience, not only for us, but also for Marcel. For him, it was the very first time that he told the story from start to end. And as a result, he put things in chronology. This presented him with a clarity that he'd never seen before. Furthermore, the understanding of peers and friends helped him to slowly overcome his feelings of shame and guilt. And today, Marcel can handle his intimate relations much better than before. I'm really grateful for facilitating this change and helping Marcel to put his feelings into perspective. And I'm proud that today he really understands that saying no is not only okay, but that saying no is the basis of a healthy and intimate relationship. Thank you.
Thank you, Menno, and thank you for your inspirational talk. We will go on a short break right now, and then we'll go to our next panel.
Sure. Thank you.
am letting this normally happens at GDC. This is the 6th year we've done all of this. Naturally, due to everything in the world, that didn't happen. If you're in San Francisco, I hope you're safe. If you're not in San Francisco, I hope you're still safe. I'm about an hour south in my bedroom, or in my living room. It's great. First off, I want to sort of thank some community people and sort of those that helped get this thing put together. I really want to thank sort of the GDC Plan B group, Kate Edwards and everybody, for finding a way to wrangle everybody and see who's still able to give a talk, given all of the space, but also then having to rapidly readjust to everything that's happened over the last week and a half. Like, my original plan was to head up to San Francisco and do this thing physically and do it all do it all on Monday. And then that fell through. And then figuring out how to do a digital version was definitely a huge jump, and figuring out the technology. With that, I want to thank the Puyallup Performing Arts Academy, which is my family's children's theater. They are sponsoring this Zoom account right now. So thanks, Mom, for paying for Zoom. You're real sweet. I am very happy. And finally, I want to thank Artisy Draft, who reached out earlier today. Normally, they sponsor one of our Write Club prizes. Given that Write Club isn't happening because we're not at a bar, or we're not at a bar, they've still offered a copy of the software, which I'll be giving out at the end of the roundtable today. So I'm very happy to hear that this is an option still, and we can incentivize you guys and just have a small thank you for giving away your hour to do this with us. So the way these roundtables usually go is I try to be as very open and encouraging of how we want to talk about things. I try to be as optimistic as possible, because in past years there have been mass layoffs a week before GDC and nobody's happy. And we're writers, so none of us can get work, or we just got work and are beyond excited. Or we're usually in a room with like half students, half veterans. So some people have a bunch of knowledge they want to share. Some are ridiculously hungry for knowledge and they want to absorb it all. But getting the same amount of information uniformed has always been a fascinating challenge with these things. So normally the way that I like setting it up is kind of having the sessions divided into thirds, maybe a little more, a little less, starting off with what game, sort of with an open question of what games over the last year or so have you found really exciting? What have you loved recently? What works of art have really inspired you? Second, third is what do we want to see in the future? And sort of what things are we looking forward to coming up? What techniques, what technologies, what pieces of narrative do you think are going to really be a huge deal in the near future? And then in the last sort of third, have more of an open problem section where we can ask questions and really try to dive into, hey, this is what I'm working on. I don't know how this is going to work. What knowledge can you give me? And try to balance that as best as we can. But given the state of Corona, if we want more of an open problem space, we can kind of set that up because I know all of us have a lot of questions right now. I know getting work has become infinitely harder, and I've just had to let a few on-site opportunities disappear. So if we end up wanting to discuss those things, I'm more than happy to it. With that, feel free to have one person unmute themselves and kind of discuss a game or just sort of a work of art, a work of narrative that's really inspired them recently.
I'm gonna go, can you hear me?
Yes, hi there.
Hi, I'm gonna go with the obvious one, Disco Elysium. Just because it has to be mentioned every single time any writing comes up as the game that did not receive a memo that you cannot make these so many permutations and write so many dialogues and still make it coherent, and they still managed to do it. And kind of every RPG, playing every RPG after Disco Elysium feels like the dialogues are not as good as Disco Elysium, and you can't get past it.
Yeah, Disco's been fantastic, and I'm happy to see it getting the praise it deserves because it kind of showed up out of nowhere. I think GameSpot did a really good video feature on sort of how they got to making Disco Elysium, which is worth watching. Mm-hmm. Any other games recommended right now?
I have one. So I just started playing last week a little single-player analog role-playing game called 1,000-Year Vampire by Tim Hutchinson, who is a professor of game design at Peoria State University. And it's a really interesting single-player role-playing game. It's in the form of a book that's been made to look aged and weathered, so the artifact itself is really lovely and beautiful. But actually, unlike most book role-playing games, which are like Choose Your Adventure, it's a little different in that it uses the physicality of the fact that you have to write down your memories, but you don't have enough space to write them as part of the game mechanic, because you're a vampire that lives for thousands of years, and you will ultimately forget things, and you have to like erase stuff. And that's really powerful because you actually have to make a decision about what memories are you letting go. So do you actually let go of how you became a vampire in order to remember this lovely new experience that you just had? But what does that mean about you? And by playing it, through playing it, it's very generative. It's not like Choose Your Adventure. It's like, what is your memory? Talk about it. I've actually had many moments of like tension of like, should I forget this? No, that would be really bad if I forget this. Like my one true love who I used to know in ancient Egypt. I don't want to forget him, but I also, it's really powerful and interesting. And there's a PDF version available as well, which is lower cost. But if you're interested in single player analog games, 1,000-Year Vampire, the book is well worth it.
Would you please repeat the name?
It's called 1,000-Year Vampire, and it's by Tim Hutchinson.
Thank you.
All right. Any other games?
Yeah, I just met the studio here in the Bay Area called Midboss. They made a game called 2064 Read Only Memories. Really good game, LGBTQ representation. It has just like really likable characters. You wake up in your room and out of nowhere there's a robot talking about, oh, hi, I noticed that your room was like really messy, so I've taken the liberty of cleaning everything. It's like, who are you? So really good game, lovable characters. It's very mystery based, like you're trying to solve murders and whatnot. And yeah, like I love how they're able to integrate natural representation where you're seeing a bartender with sleeves up. It's like he doesn't look over the top, but you can tell, yeah, he's probably a LGBTQ folk. That was a bad sentence. But yeah, 2064.
Great. CC, do you want to say something? I saw that you want to raise a hand, I think.
Yeah, I just think it's a little odd that we're going by whoever's jumping on this first, because like in my experience that tends to let the loudest people go constantly. But like because I've done Zoom chats where there was a hand raising feature. Yeah, I mean, I guess we don't have one, so well, okay, I guess I'll go.
We have one. Sorry to interject. We have one. If you click on participants down below, near the share, there's an option to raise hand. Which hand kind of?
Oh, okay. Thanks. Yeah, I was like, I don't use Zoom that often, so I didn't see it. But it's good that we have it now. Okay, well, I guess I'm already talking. So, I would have to say the best game that I played last year, and I played a lot of games, is, and I know this is going to be controversial, but Fire Emblem Three Houses, which I'm like personally, I think that emotional intelligence wins over most kinds of mechanical complexity, and I think it's severely underexplored, and it's the kind of game making technique that like has largely been very marginalized as we like talk about like proc gen or like smarter AI, and I'm like, well, there's a whole like other aspect of game making that we kind of like that it's hard to like talk about. Because like honestly, like the politics, the world building, and like just the sheer like humanness of the characters is stuff that like I have not seen any game accomplish in like years. And it's just also made me think about how like anime games are like so like extremely underrated in the American market, and how like even though there are animes that are better than prestige television shows that Americans are shooting right now, it's like I have not met a single game writer who wants to talk about Fate Grand Order or like any of those other games that have like been hugely successful based on being really, really emotionally connected. And I mean, and I say this as someone who got an IGF nomination with zero voice acting budget or back end. So it's definitely like just like the emotional aspect is like I think is really important.
All right, great. CJ and then Vaughn.
I would say like one of my recommendations this year has been Coffee Talk. It like takes an interesting like sort of kind of like instead of telling the story like as you the main character, a lot of the story and a lot of the world building comes from you listening to other people's stories. And I found that a very interesting sort of approach to things. Like Valhalla also does this as well. But a lot of the storytelling for that one comes in like you're a passive character, you're not really making anything happen, you're just watching other people's stories unfold. And I found that really interesting and very relaxing. And it was nice to see like a look into kind of an alternate world Seattle. It's very short, so I definitely recommend it.
Right. Vaughn.
So I only got around to playing it within this last year. I may be late to the punch, but it's called The Red Strings Club, and it's you play as a bartender and a cyberpunk hacker, and it deals with emotions and altering emotions to talk with people and kind of convince them to tell you what you need to know as a communication person. He's an information dealer, so he's trying to collect information, and you're trying to bring down this huge corporation. And so it's like what Cece was talking about with that emotional connectivity, and it manages to pack a very interesting and a very well-built story into almost a very small space, and you kind of see how your choices affect the things you can do later on in the game. And I just really liked it. I think it was really interesting, and it's impacted the way I've talked about character interactions and what you can do with a very limited dialogue.
Right. Note, we're recording as of now because I forgot to start recording earlier. Next up is Max.
Hello?
Hi there, Max.
Okay. Sorry, we're packing up right now, so my place is a complete mess. But Control, I felt Control had a very unique way of showing environmental storytelling it just blew me away personally, especially with the different kinds of videos and the letters that were left around. I felt that this is the first game in a really long time that I've actually been engaged to actually learn about the world and look into the writing in the game that is just text instead of learning through everything around. I really wanted to learn about what's happening and how we're learning about the oldest house and these artifacts of power through the writing and discovering what happened rather than just being punched in the face with it over and over again by the game.
Right. Stav.
Hello. Stav, yeah. I recently played Zachtronics Eliza. It's a visual novel where you play as a woman who is going to work at a software company she used to work at as a software engineer, but now as a proxy, which is a new job where you sit in a room with an AI therapist, and a client comes in to meet the therapist, the AI. And because they can never break the chatbot interface, the AI essentially dictates your script as you're in the therapy session, essentially, so that you can give therapy to the client. So mechanically, there's an interesting thing where there's the contrast between your regular conversation where you have multiple dialogue options and the therapy session where you generally only have one, which just creates a very natural tension because you're used to this thing, but it's something that's taken away from you, and it kind of makes you question the whole, setup. And in general, what I found about it that was current, it felt extremely close to home because I am also a software engineer living in the Seattle area. And I also identified with the main character. It made me ask genuine questions about my career and where we're heading towards. It asked questions about data privacy. About data privacy. What does a company that collects all this therapy data do with it? What potential does it have for abuse? What does it mean to work for a large corporation, knowing that everything you contribute is going to be later used by people much bigger than you for things you can't control? Those are all things that kind of were floating around, and then this interfacing with this game kind of let me explore them further, and it was a very emotional experience to kind of see myself reflected in that way.
For sure. I'll second Eliza. It was fantastic. I also like that we've had several suggestions at this point about cyberpunk titles in Seattle. If there's one thing going on, that's how you make a hit story in your video game. All right. Zaire?
Hi. I'm a little late to the party, but I've been playing through Senua recently, and I've really enjoyed the way that the story explores Senua's internal turmoil and how the game environment reflects her internal darkness, and how you're walking her through all her fears and the different puzzles, because the gameplay mechanics are pretty simple. The combat's not all that deep, and you have a few puzzles here and there. But I think for me the most interesting part of the story has been the way the sound is. Senua's Sacrifice. The way the sound tells the story through the voices whispering in her head and how it's mirrored in the environment. And it's just been a really interesting and unnerving playthrough that I think is a pretty decent depiction of mental illness. It has its flaws for sure, but it's been really interesting to play through.
All right. And Kenji, I'll let you take us home on the last bit of recommendations.
All right. Well, I've only got one, so it's not going to be too long. So it's a game I've been eyeing for about the past year. I've been wanting to play it for a while now, and I've been closer and closer to getting to it. But it's called We the Revolution. You can find it on Steam. It's enthralled me with its premise more than anything else. It's set in 1794 Paris during the French Revolution. I think it's an incredibly interesting setting, not one that I usually see that often, so it got my fancy. And its gameplay is kind of reminiscent of how, it's the only kind of comparison I can make, is Divinity Dragon Commander, where there are a combination of different game styles to kind of push along the narrative. It's primarily kind of in a visual novel format where you're interacting with 2D graphics that are, reacting to you on screen. But it also opens up to a sort of turn-based tactics kind of thing, and as well as kind of like a deck building mechanic. It's got like a lot of stuff going on, but basically serve as a judge, jury, and executioner during the French Revolution, and I think we can all imagine how good that goes. So yeah, I think it's a really interesting premise, and its graphics its art style is pretty good. It's like 2D polygonal. That's it for me.
All right, cool. It seems like there was a small jump near the end of your bit, Kenji, but We the Revolution is a great recommendation. I'll also want to recommend just sort of something else that I haven't really seen in the discussion. Katana Zero managed to do a lot of playful stuff with its text elements, sort of in order to drive the story, or a very sort of Tarantino-esque, very aggressive, violent, neon 80s sort of narrative. They really use multiple typefaces and fonts and sort of graphical effects in the text to deliver the impact of the words more than the words themselves. And that's a part of storytelling that I will always want to recommend other game designers use, because playful text is more fun than text itself every day. Michelle in the comments also recommended NeoCab, which is great and has a lot of good voice artists, or has a lot of very talented writers sort of collaborating on that title. And anytime you get more than one writer working on a game, I will always give it the thumbs up. Where the Water Tastes Like Wine also kind of sits in that window. So with that, I want to sort of move on to the next bit of the roundtable, where I want to discuss the future of narrative design and game writing. Sort of, where do we think it's going to go? What do we want to see? What are we excited about? What do we want to look at next year and go, that was the best thing that happened. This is going to be really cool. These are the projects that are exciting me right now. So if we could get a hand raised or two in that front, we can get going on this part of the conversation. All right, Kenji.
So for me personally, I think probably the most pivotal game to come out this year is going to have to be Cyberpunk, just because of how much talk has been circulating around it, and how the reputation of CD Projekt Red has been with Witcher 3. I think how they approach their storytelling in that particular world, in that setting, and with all the characters doing everything, I think it's going to give us an idea of where narrative is going to go. I don't know if it's going to be a blockbuster kind of story, but it's at least going to be very noticeable. There's going to be a lot of eyes on it. So I'm very interested to see what it does with its story.
All right, Vaughn.
I completely agree. I also think cyberpunk is going to be a big genre that people are going to be looking at. I also think survival horror with recent events is going to be a much bigger genre. That's going to be a bit of a blow up. I think that in terms of narrative mechanics, I think that timed narrative is going to be something that comes back. Like we got that with Telltale's The Walking Dead. We got that a bit with Mass Effect 3. I think that the idea of having choices that you have to do quickly with narrative design is going to come back. And I also think that having choices pop up over time is going to be something that we might see moving forward, especially with games about isolation and games about kind of fast conversation come out more.
Okay, what do you mean by sort of timed choices in that last bit? Because that sounds interesting.
So like with Telltale's games, if you wait too long, then it automatically picks the ... option. Well, I think that with certain games where dialogue heavy games are, where dialogue is important, as we know, that sometimes the best option to say isn't the first thing that comes to mind. I think that in terms of dialogue, that progressively gets better as time goes on, but also situation becomes more dire as time goes on. So you have to kind of juggle between a survival element and a possible narrative element. Should be something that looking forward would be a very interesting thing to see.
Actually sounds really cool.
Thank you.
Like dialogue choices that pop up after half the timer's gone through?
Yes.
Oh, thank you. That's awesome. Okay, we have 4 people in line. Max, then Desi, then Michelle, then Sharang.
Let me get it. Okay. So I think one thing Disco Elysium did really well was the whole idea of no combat. The idea that we can tell stories about what's happening and giving the choices for combat, but not having just going into a completely different game to do combat is just something we're going to see more often. Also, I think we're going to see a lot more of mainstream stuff that's just text, like CC's Lion Killer, come up, and I'm all here for that. I think a lot of that's people are wanting to read more and actually explore these stories instead of just fight through them.
Hi, Killer was so good. I'm happy you got a name drop here. All right, Desi. You're still muted.
Yes, I see. Yes. All right. Sorry, I'm a bit of a luddite. I think that that survival horror is definitely probably going to see a surge in popularity, but I also think on the opposite side of the spectrum, and maybe this is just me having a little bit of personal bias because these are the kind of games I'm working on, I think cozy games are going to really be huge. I think Animal Crossing is going to sell so many copies on Friday because people are looking for things that are kind of an escape from what's going on, and also places where they can gather online virtually and visit their friends who they can't visit in person, and create things that they can share with their friends in some way or another, since you can't necessarily share something you've created in person, like a baked good or something, without worrying about giving them coronavirus. So I think that that people are going to be looking towards cozy experiences, towards kind experiences, and I think that might just be the flip side of the coin.
All right, so absolute existential dread and gift giving and feeling like home. Sounds fun. All right, Michelle.
Yeah, hello?
Hi there.
Hi. So unfortunately, Desiree literally took the words right out of my mouth, because I was also going to weigh in on like the future being cozy games, because I've seen so much love for Animal Crossing, and then earlier this year, last year there was Kind Words, which allowed people to exchange letters. I also think what Cece was saying earlier about anime as an influence, I'm beginning to see more and more of that, I think, trickling in as people are becoming, to a certain extent, less and less, for lack of a better term, ashamed of it. Like, I'm seeing a little bit more, like a lot more people being willing to embrace the sort of the lavish, I want to say melodramatic, over the topness of a lot of anime, and not just like sort of the Dragon Ball Z type of thing, but like with things like Code Vein. I think, obviously anime has always, had its market, always been popular, but I feel that to a certain extent there was sort of this feeling of, well, yeah, but right now a bunch of anime fans are being real jerks, so and it's really bad, and so we're just gonna we're not doing that thing. But with the popularity, and as I was saying about Fire Emblem, I'm wondering if we're going to start seeing more open embrace of that as an aesthetic and as a feel to our stories, because anime is interesting in that it's not exactly a genre. It covers all genres. It's science fiction, it's fantasy, but there is a certain feel to it, and I'm going to be interested to see if narratively we start exploring that, not just in terms of the aesthetic, but the feel of it.
All right, interesting. All right, Sharang?
So how we can argue that the whole genre of RPGs with combat stems from, original Dungeons and Dragons and Chainmail and all that, right? And throughout the RPG genre's history, there are all these games that directly make use of tabletop role-playing game rules explicitly, right? There's a whole slew of D&D games. Baldur's Gate's coming out based on the new edition. Shadowrun has like a series of games that use the tabletop rules. And I think very interesting, and we keep coming back to Disco Elysium, for good reason probably, is that Disco Elysium makes very visible the fact that basically the game mechanics are a tabletop game, right? There isn't a lot that you cannot do tabletop apart from obviously the vast authorial content there, right? And so I'm, especially with the rise more and more of tabletop role-playing games, Critical Role, board games along with it are coming up. With the rise of that, I'm very interested, and I have a feeling, not based on any knowledge, just a feeling that other tabletop role-playing games are going to now be seen and turned into video games. And we've seen that in the somewhat indie sense, like Numenera got turned into a role-playing game. But I'm very curious, there's a lot of very innovative work out there in tabletop role-playing game. One could argue that the Powered by the Apocalypse system changed the way we think of story games. Like, what would it look like to have a video game based on Monster Hearts, right? Can you even translate that rule set? And right now, I would say it's a golden age of indie role-playing game settings with what was that Swedish one that now has a TV show on Amazon, Things from the Flood, Tales from the Loop, those kinds of games. My practice is primarily an analog world, right? So I'm very interested to see the digital world trying to grappling with these rule sets of these analog games, where I would argue some of the most innovative storytelling, narrative building mechanics are happening right now.
All right, wonderful, great. Yeah, now I would play a Monster Hearts. Like when you started talking, my mind first went to, I want to play a Monster Hearts video game. All right, Tobias.
Sure. I actually be a bit in line with Sharan, what he just said. I think what we will see is like a change in scope of games. I think the time of the big AAA endless long stories is coming to an end, including with the connected long production budgets, stuff. I think it now branches more to smaller. So something similar as what we see with the influencers on Twitch or YouTube, like that our worlds and our products become more an identity thing. So I'm playing this kind of game, and I'm more interested in experiencing more than one story in this world or in this universe or whatever you want to say it, which is very similar to what we see in the traditional tabletop RPG genre, which was usually you picked up D&D because you liked the Forgotten, the Sword Coast, the Forgotten Realms. You picked up Vampire because you liked the setting. You picked up Shadowrun because you want to run the cyberpunk universe with this specific background. And I think this is coming back, and it's now making basically its return to computer games, not necessarily with complete and complex rule sets, but more like with, I would say it almost bite-sized stories. Someone can play maybe through like building his identity, because I think people nowadays do not really are willing any longer, except for a small minority, to invest 50, 60, 70 hours experiencing the full story. So we are more seeing like 10 hours, the max. And then rather like, okay, I finished the story part, but then similar to probably what Mass Effect tried to do, my consequences, my decisions are carrying over for the next part and for the next part. And then I play the next 5 years into the same universe, and maybe, when I say 10 different stories, which is not truly episodic like Telltale games, but more like, again, traditional tabletop RPG. I'm playing my hero, I experience different stories, go to different places in the world. And I think this is coming way more over the next years. And then also another thing that we will see coming up is AR, doing storytelling in the real world with augmented reality. So I think there's a huge area where we can also, as narrative designers, grow and bring our knowledge to like, how can we combine those two elements? I mean, Pokemon Go was one approach, but how can we combine this with story elements would be the next cool idea to engage people. And how can we do this in a way that we tell meaningful stories and also share knowledge of our experiences and thus grow as a society in general. I think that's kind of like the trends that we will see over the maybe not necessarily just the next year, but maybe the next 5 years.
Right. Great. I want to cut the topic off after Isaiah, so nobody else raised their hand. Nick, you are going next.
Hey, everybody. Yeah, so kind of when you pose this question, I at first had one thought, and then Tobias actually said all that and specifically mentioned the idea of like, yeah, no one really has that much time to do like a 60, 70, 80, 90 long RPG anymore. And I was like, oh, yeah, totally. That's very true as well. So I've actually got two quick things. The first one is I'm not as knowledgeable about this particular game, but I know a couple months ago, Dreams for PS4 came out, and people have been using that to create all kinds of like cool, fun, like audiovisual gamey type things. And I've only taken a little bit about it, so like if everyone has more knowledge than I do, of course that will you simply have more knowledge than I do. But my initial impression was that like this is actually a pretty big tool for like allowing for kind of taking like game creation in general and putting it to people who may not have considered game design or game narrative before, like people who are just kind of playing games and are now like, oh wait, there's this game that I can play that will allow me to kind of create my own games, my own stories. So I wonder if one of two things, either A, that's going to lead more people, A, into game design in general, but perhaps more specifically into narrative design and storytelling, and B, if perhaps we might see more games that are kind of like Dreams, that kind of like focus on this creativity aspect. Like for example, I'm going to leave details out because from what I understand, this is I was contacted a little while ago about a startup that I was considering working for, so I won't like say who or what they're doing exactly, but I know they're kind of pursuing a similar angle. So I wonder if kind of like more games that are about creating your own content and sharing it with people and sharing your stories might become more prevalent. Yeah, otherwise, on a slightly related note, kind of just going off of what Tobias brought up, which I thought was really brilliant, the idea that, like the Persona 5s of the world, or like the Fire Emblems, which while fantastic games are like very lengthy to get the entire story, I have noticed that on like the mobile side of things, there are a lot of like choice-based kind of visual novel stuff that you can find these days. A lot in the romance genre, like chapters and episode and that kind of thing, as well as things like the Arcana and just like a whole ton of stuff like that. So kind of going off of someone else said it. Unfortunately, I don't know everyone's names here. I believe it was. I'm sorry, I can't like whoever said it. I apologize for not crediting you. But yeah, just the idea of like text maybe making some of a comeback. I think maybe that's already happening in the mobile space to a degree. And then also going off of what Tobias said, kind of like bite-sized small games that you can play over the course of like a couple minutes each day. And I think we see a lot of both of those things happening in the mobile space right now.
Great, I agree. Eli.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, hi.
Hello. So I forgot who said this, but time, I think will also I agree with that. Like 12 minutes is a game that I'm looking forward to. It's a indie game that is a time loop in and of itself, and the entire game takes place in real time in 12 minutes. And through each loop you gain information and the story unfolds every time you die. So I think like that kind of concept for games is gonna become more prevalent. Working with like games as a concept to see what you can bring out of that, as well as I've been recently seeing a lot of people talking about Death Stranding and how you know this whole event situation is kind of like that, and so I feel like more grounded realism games are going to become bigger, seeing how the coronavirus and the pandemic is happening and making people just look at the real world more.
Right.
What are your
Evgeny?
thoughts on racism?
Evgeny?
The first one was right. I wanted to kind of piggyback on that comment, is from Tobias's comment that given that we are starting to make more and more short games and they get more bigger prominence, people are also getting more.
Nicholas,
more
what is up?
All right, keep going.
They're also getting more prominence in terms
Nicholas!
of. They're getting more prominence in terms of. We can do more.
Sorry about that.
We can do more and more experiments, and people are doing more and more experiments, and they get more prominence. We can afford to do case studies. We can afford to experiment with different emotions and player state, given that it's not necessarily a bigger production, although, of course, the smaller, shorter game does not necessarily mean the budget will be much, much smaller. Sometimes it's even the other way around, and also comedy games also fit well into the short format, which is pretty neat to see. And also a lot of other people try, since it's easier to not easier, but it's easier to get into and fall into the deep hole of making a short game. We can see kind of like way more different things, like different communities, indie communities developing more games, like what comes out of Spanish community with their distinctive sense of style and art, and French games and political Austrian games and so on, which is pretty damn good to see.
Yeah, I've seen a few RPGs coming out of Brazil, and I find all of them fascinating and gorgeous. Let's close this up with Isaiah and then move on to the next topic.
Yeah, I'm definitely interested in seeing more. Someone made a note about kind games. I love that idea. You know, I played Wander Song, very colorful, very awesome messages about using more than the standard violence in video games to get through problems, while at the same time showing that the character is strong through their pacifism, rather than that movie, the one where Will Smith played an animated spy, where there were a bunch of messages about pacifism, but I feel like millennials were misrepresented in the sense that it made them feel weaker, rather than like Wander Song or even Undertale, where it's like, no, you're still strong, you just choose not to kill everybody.
For sure. That'd be great. And Wander Song is so good. I love how many specific references we're giving here. All right, for the next 20 minutes, and maybe we can go a little over, preferably not, I want to discuss sort of having more open problem session where we're able to ask questions that we might be going through and kind of use our collective wisdom to try to solve things. There's a lot of questions. Normally, a lot of things like, I have this project and now this is happening. Given the case of Corona, I'm sort of in a position of how am I going to find my next job now that GDC is gone? Like, once this week's meetings are empty, I'm not sure where to go after this. And I'm sure a lot of us are dealing with this. So this can be a very open conversation that may or may not need to be heavily rooted in sort of just the narrative problems. I also want to use this opportunity right now so I can talk less as we go on to discuss upcoming things with the IGDA's game writing group. Right Club, unfortunately, got canceled because I lost the bar because of everything. We will be figuring out a way to do that digitally. We're discussing having some more constructive online focus conferences to try to help share knowledge as best as possible. I also am trying to set up some sort of game jam or writing contest where you're able to have a month to work on a 5-minute title and then have judging and prizes going out that way. Sort of creating a lot of really interesting opportunities to keep this community tight and close, given that we don't necessarily have the immediate location that we usually do. And with that, Artisy Draft, as I said, has given us a free copy of their software today. I sort of pulled a random number generator to make sure that I could just kind of decide who's getting it right now. And Nicholas, you are in place to get it. So reach out to me after this and I will get you your email address and we'll give you a free copy of Artisy Draft.
Just to verify, Nicholas Carbonara?
Yes, you.
Thank you.
Yeah, I should be using last names.
Well, very much appreciate it. That's really cool.
All right, so Tobias, who also works with me with the IGDA, for those of you that aren't immediately connected with that, has got a few words, and then feel free to raise your hand with an open problem as soon as Tobias has finished.
Yes, thanks, Alex. And yeah, as Alex just said, like we are basically talking quite a bit recently how we can help our community and work together more. And especially now that we don't have this opportunity to meet in person and having the right club and other events that we usually have throughout the year. So one thing that we had in mind, just as Alex already said, is like we try to bring something like a game writing jam / write club that is a little bit longer to the online platform. We are not sure yet when we will start. So probably it will be around summer with the organization, also with nice prizes. And also like basically to encourage everyone to engage. So the idea basically is taken from write a novel in a month, and we are turning it into something probably more like write a game in a month. So as the base idea here. And the other things that we do like, just to tease a bit at this point, is what we started talking about is organizing a virtual writers conference where we have different topics and experts joining us, talking and sharing their experience, and make it also possible for the community to interact with them, to ask questions. Because again, one of our main objectives is to help all of us to grow and to share our knowledge and to get better in what we're doing. If you have any ideas or things that you would like to do, spearhead, or kind of like organize, and we can support you in this, feel free to reach out. We're open to see what we can do. And I think this is pretty much it at this point. The conference is probably something that we're talking from a time frame, maybe the third quarter of this year, because it needs a bit of time to prepare. But yeah, we're working on it, and we're excited to bring some new exciting things soon to the community.
So with that, if anybody wants to raise their hand and ask a question to the panel, we can start getting things moving. All right, Nicholas.
Hey. Yeah, so kind of where I'm at in my career right now is very much maybe kind of like a bit of a specific location or specific question that I've got here, but just in case anyone has any knowledge or expertise in it. Right now, where I'm at in my career is I'm very much right at the beginning of my games writing career. Right now, I'm in the middle of my very first game writing contract job, which is doing adaptations of romance novels for the Chapters platform, which is pretty neat. Definitely not what I expected, but kind of been really interesting and a great chance to learn a lot of things. But kind of one thing I want to pose to the room, just as someone who's kind of personally just trying to get my own future sorted out and trying to figure out where I can go and where I want to go and those kinds of things within the games industry and within games narrative, is does anyone have like any stories for kind of where they've been able to go with kind of experience like mine in terms of like once like has anyone been able to work on visual novels or like things for mobile text-based games and then transition to other things? Or is that kind of mostly good for like working their way up in the in writing for more mobile games, that kind of thing? And the main reason I'm asking is because this current gig is kind of neat, but it would be kind of cool to like work on other stuff in different types of games as well. So I'm just kind of trying to see what my options are, what I can do to kind of broaden my options, if that makes any sense.
Sure. Desi, it seems like you're commenting in the comment section. Do you want to unmute and share some knowledge?
Sure. I mean, I started out in interactive novels as well, although they weren't called that back then, because, okay, dating myself here. But yeah, one of the games that I worked on was a title for the Nintendo DS that I had an amazing review in which somebody actually pulled the game out of trash can on the video review and said that they're taking the game out of the garbage because it belongs in the garbage because it's not an actual game, because all you're doing is picking things to say. So that was a real thing that happened. And I feel a bit vindicated, like, okay, now we were pioneers, because now it's a massively successful genre of games, interactive novels, and people don't say, is this really a game anymore? But I think that especially if you're going to be somebody who might need to work remotely, working in mobile games is great because I feel like it's one of the few sort of areas in the industry that has that kind of flexibility that they don't feel like they really necessarily need to have you in-house. This isn't true for all studios, but I do find that it does exist more so in mobile games than it does, maybe necessarily in like a AAA or somebody who's making like a big MMO or something type of game. And in my experience, translating that, having worked for that audience into other games that also appeal to that same audience is one of the easiest ways to kind of get your foot in the door with maybe other styles of games that aren't interactive novels, but are still going to be marketed to that same player. And so that's one way that I've kind of approached the studios that have something different going on. It's like, okay, well, I haven't made your specific kind of game, but I know this player really, really well, and I know what they're looking for and what appeals to them and what doesn't appeal to them. And if you can kind of make that pitch, I think that that's something that that actually people will really respect, because it shows that you're interested in the audience and you're not looking down on it or kind of I don't know, like they're not real players or whatever people might say. That's one tack I would take.
Thank you. That's very helpful.
Yeah, and to build off that, I've had a lot of success recently adapting children's books to Alexa, which kind of gives me a great test bed for having a very eager audience, a very new platform, and you can do a lot of interesting and dynamic choices through it because nobody knows what's going on there. It won't be the widest audience, but the projects have been very exciting. I'm going to go to Stav and then Sharam.
Oh, thank you. My question was to Cece, actually, from way back earlier in the discussion. You mentioned emotional intelligence and how you'd like to see that as a thing that grows and develops in games. And the thing that makes it easier for me to see mechanics of progress is the kind of modeling of it, which makes it easier to standardize. And I kind of think of it as a thing that has a base knowledge. And I'm trying to think about emotional intelligence in the same way. And so my question is, how would you either develop emotional intelligence? How have you developed emotional intelligence individually as a writer, or what would you recommend for crafting a model of it that can be standardized and many can learn from? I was curious about your thoughts on that.
Damn, I really need to actually think about writing this into a talk, huh? My long answer, this is more long term, is honestly stop just focusing on games that actually branch out and read things that are not in the games medium, because games, I think, out of a lot of mediums are flailing really badly at emotional intelligence and understanding intimacy and weaponizing intimacy. And I'm not talking about sex. I'm talking about actually being vulnerable and things that are where the game is actually trying to reach the player. I think that's a huge weakness that has persisted to this day. And my background was in history, so I would say that my expertise was understanding how humans react when they're scared, how humans react when the world is falling apart, how do humans react when when someone more powerful than them are calling the shots. So that was my background, and honestly, I am way grateful that I did that instead of doing necessarily doing a specialist computer science or a games degree, because then I was totally unconstrained by ideas of this is how you portray emotions in games, because I find it because there's so many emotion is such a subjective thing that I find it kind of weird to try to standardize it, because I actually wrote a Gama Sutra article. I mean, I interview about this. When I was interviewed for IGF, I was talking about how emotional design is not something you can control. It's not, you can't control how players feel. Because some like really badass scenes that make some people feel empowered makes me feel really bad, makes me feel really angry, or makes me feel really sad. And that's not something that any game designer can control. So like I try to say that it's about giving players like tools, giving players the ambiguity to feel things, but also like understanding how like because like I think this is seriously like one of those areas where it's really hard to like be like take a 6-month course and like you walk away being really good at it. And I think just being alive and like taking in other perspectives helps a lot about this, more so than like trying to like learn how to how to use mechanics to achieve this.
Thank you.
So I had a really quick response to both Nicholas and to the last person who spoke, whose name I can't remember.
Stav.
I always tell people that this is going to be me sound like a broken record, but analog games, especially LARPs and tabletop role-playing games, are an excellent way to explore human emotion and how. I teach neurodiverse kids socio-emotional skills using tabletop role-playing games, right? So these are great ways to learn about complexities of human imagination. I don't just mean D&D. I mean play weird, small games about emotion, play LARPs about the AIDS crisis, play role-playing games about, like all these weird things exist, right? So I think that's a great way to explore the writerly instinct of how will characters react? How do characters feel? Just a plug for my craft. And then to Nicholas, one thing I always tell my undergrads is I always say, don't stop working on small projects, because A, that keeps your brain thinking and of new things, and B, that if you're working on a really long project and it takes a long time to work on and it hasn't come out yet, you can still be putting out work that employers and curators and stuff are looking at. So for example, self-publishing on itch.io has become a huge thing now, right? But also, if you want to look for paying markets, SubQ Magazine is a paying SIFWA recognized market that publishes interactive fiction, right? It's sub-Q. Similarly, I think Uncanny, and I think it's always Strange Horizons, one of those two, they're the foremost science fiction online and magazines right now in America. So I think one of those two also takes interactive fiction submissions. So I would say keep working on short things and putting it out there, because that's what I do. And that will keep your brain working. It'll keep people being interested in the work that you're continually pushing at.
Wonderful reply. It seems like you have a demand for lists of the tabletop games you're using, so feel free to throw that in the chat. And thank you to everyone in the chat. Like, it's wonderful to have sort of this sub-conversation to echo everybody's thoughts. You're all fantastic, and I love you all. Moving on to Eli.
This is a question for Sharang. Did I say it right?
No, but no one does. It's fine. Keep going.
I'm so sorry. But in, I guess, response to that, what would you say the best way to showcase, I guess, your writing would be? I'm trying to get into games writing myself, but I direct, produce, and write audio dramas and distribute those out. So how best what is the best way to like showcase that, to show, yeah, I play a lot of games, I'm able to write, I'm just not, I don't have like the skills to make a full game. I guess maybe other than like Twine as examples, but not showing, if that makes sense.
So the academic in me cringes at your distinction between a full game and other kinds of games, but we're not going to get into that. I'm sure other people here are a bit more knowledgeable about this, but what I would do is I do a lot of, well, not as much anymore, but like putting things on itch is good. Submitting to like calls and like magazines and stuff is good. I aggressively pitch games to art shows. Like, I aggressively do this, and they rarely get accepted, but I still do it because then curators are looking at your work. There are a couple of festivals, like the Hand-Eye Society in Toronto, for example, takes narrative games and shows them. Pixel Pop has the Flow Gallery that takes innovative small games, and your interactive audio drama sounds like a great thing to that. So I always look for places to submit, look for contests, look for shows, because that's where you get eyeballs. And with that, I'm joining another GDC call. So thank you, everyone. I'm signing off. Other people probably can answer that better than me. So bye.
Yep. Thank you so much, Sarang. All right, with that, we are basically out of time. So first off, I want to thank everybody for coming here. Sort of my hope was to get at least 20 people. We managed to get around 40 at the peak of the talk. You're all fantastic. I hope you got something out of this and had a good time chatting. If you have any feedback, we don't have time for it now, but please send me an email or a Facebook message or a Twitter DM or a Discord. However you heard about this is probably somewhere through me and around there. I want to know what you thought because I want to make this better, especially as we do a game writing SIG game jam and set up a conference. Like, if we're going to build this up, I need as much knowledge as possible to help you guys help me. You're all fantastic. I love you all. If you want to throw any sort of last couple thoughts out, I'll have one more person raise their hand and say anything before I close this all out. And I can just keep chatting until somebody decides to raise their hand and sign us off. All right, cool. If there's nothing, that's totally okay. You guys are fantastic. Be sure to kind of give us a chat. Yeah, somebody needs to yell Nick. All right, with that, you're all fantastic. Be safe. Hopefully get work. Let me know if you have work for me, because we're all in the same boat. And I'll talk to you all when we're done. So have a great rest of your time. Feel free to log off. I need to figure out how to do that on my end. All right, talk to you all later. Okay, bye.